"Sir, could you pretend to be my husband just for one day?" whispered the fat 18-year-old. The words stop a rugged rancher in his tracks. In the middle of a dusty frontier street, church bell tolling, the girl clings to his sleeve as a drunken mob jeers. Her father is ready to sell her for whiskey, and the saloon-keeper waits with forged papers and a cruel grin. But when the rancher steps forward, everything changes. One act of mercy sparks a firestorm of gossip, scandal, and danger. Because hidden inside her late mother's Bible is a secret deed to land that could control the valley's only water. Now, whispers turn to threats, and enemies circle like wolves in the snow. She is mocked as worthless, yet may hold the power to save them all. Will this one desperate plea for a pretend husband become her salvation or her ruin? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the Colorado settlement, casting long shadows across the dusty main street. Heat waves rippled off the weathered wooden buildings, and the few horses tied to hitching posts hung their heads listlessly. Outside the saloon, a crowd had gathered, drawn by the loud, slurred voice of a man whose desperation had overcome what little dignity he had left. "Step right up!" Sabrina's father bellowed, swaying on his feet. His face was flushed from drink, and dark sweat stains spread across his wrinkled shirt. "My girl here'll make someone a fine wife. Who'll start the bidding to clear my debts?" 18-year-old Sabrina stood nearby, her round face burning with shame. She wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to disappear, her ill-fitting dress doing little to hide her heavy-set frame. Though legally of age, her youth showed in her trembling lips and the way she kept her eyes fixed on the packed dirt at her feet. Cruel laughter rippled through the growing crowd. "Ain't exactly prime merchandise," someone called out, triggering more jeers. "I reckon she'd eat a man out of house and home," another voice added, followed by fresh guffaws. Tears welled in Sabrina's eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. She'd learned long ago that showing weakness only made things worse. Her father had gambled away everything else: their farm, her mother's jewelry, even the family Bible. Now he'd sunk so low as to try selling his own flesh and blood. The saloon-keeper stepped out onto his establishment's creaky wooden porch, a calculating smile spreading across his face. He raised his hand lazily, like a man bidding on cattle. "I might be willing to take her off your hands," he drawled. "Clear your tab, and then some." A hush fell over the crowd. Everyone knew what sort of marriage the saloon-keeper was offering. He'd done this before with other desperate women, using their bodies to pay off their men's gambling debts until they were broken in spirit. Sabrina's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Her eyes darted frantically around the crowd until they landed on a tall figure standing apart from the others. Christian, the mountain rancher who lived outside town, watched the scene with quiet intensity. Though his face remained impassive, his jaw was clenched tight with barely contained anger. She'd seen him around town over the years, always treating folks fair in his dealings. Whispers said he'd been a devoted husband until his wife's death left him alone on that big ranch. Without conscious thought, Sabrina's feet carried her toward him. Her trembling fingers caught the sleeve of his weathered leather coat. "Sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crowd's murmuring. "Could you pretend to be my husband just for one day?" Christian's dark eyes met hers, surprise flickering across his usually stoic features. For a heartbeat that seemed to stretch forever, he studied her face. Then, something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes, a strengthening of resolve. With deliberate movements, he stepped between Sabrina and the leering crowd. His broad shoulders cast a protective shadow over her smaller frame as he placed a steady hand on her shoulder. Though he wasn't a man for raising his voice, when he spoke, his words carried clearly across the suddenly silent street. "This young lady is under my protection," Christian declared. His quiet tone held an edge of steel that made even the boldest troublemakers take a step back. "There'll be no auction today." The saloon-keeper's smile turned ugly. "Now see here, Christian. The girl's father owes me money. A debt's a debt. Whatever he owes, I'll settle it." Christian's hand remained firm on Sabrina's shoulder, and she found herself drawing strength from his solid presence. But not with her dignity. Sabrina's father stumbled forward, his bloodshot eyes narrowing. "You ain't got no right. She's my daughter." "And you ain't fit to call yourself her father," Christian replied evenly. "A man who'd sell his own child ain't worth the breath it takes to argue with." Whispers raced through the crowd like wind through prairie grass. Some nodded in approval at Christian's words, while others exchanged knowing looks about the sudden marriage. A few of the women who'd been laughing earlier now looked ashamed, avoiding Sabrina's eyes. Christian turned slightly, keeping himself between Sabrina and the others. "Come along," he said quietly to her. "My wagon's just down the street." Sabrina fell into step beside him, hardly daring to breathe. His hand remained steady on her shoulder as they walked away from the saloon, the whispers and stares following in their wake. She could hear her father's drunken protests fading behind them, but for the first time in years she didn't feel bound by them. The late afternoon sun caught the dust their boots kicked up as they walked, creating a golden haze around them. Christian's wagon stood waiting, his two strong horses stamping impatiently in the heat. Each step taking her further from the crowd felt like a step toward something she hardly dared to name. Hope, perhaps, or at least a chance at dignity. Only when they reached the wagon did Christian remove his hand from her shoulder. He turned to face her fully, his expression grave but kind. "You're safe now," he said simply. "No one's going to auction you off or harm you. You have my word on that." Sabrina's legs trembled with relief, the full weight of what had nearly happened and what this stranger had prevented, hitting her all at once. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I don't know how I can ever repay—" Christian held up a hand to stop her. "No talk of repaying. What that crowd was fixing to do wasn't right. A man's got a duty to stand against such things. That's all there is to it." Behind them, the sound of boots on wooden planks made Sabrina tense. But when she turned, she saw several of the town's more respectable citizens watching from a distance, nodding in approval. The tide of public opinion had shifted, shame replacing cruel amusement as people realized how close they'd come to allowing a terrible thing to happen. Christian opened the wagon's door with careful courtesy. "Let's get you away from here," he said. "We can figure out the rest once we're clear of town." As Sabrina climbed into the wagon, she caught a glimpse of her father being led back into the saloon by the angry owner. For the first time, she felt no obligation to rescue him from his own choices. Whatever happened next, she knew she'd found something precious. Not just protection, but respect, offered freely by a man who asked nothing in return. The wagon's wooden seat was warm from the sun as she settled onto it. Christian climbed up beside her, taking up the reins with capable hands. As they pulled away from the settlement, the dust of the street trailing behind them, Sabrina realized she was trembling not from fear anymore, but from the overwhelming sense that her life had just changed forever. The whispers about their strange marriage followed them out of town, but they seemed to matter less with each turning of the wagon's wheels. Christian kept his eyes on the road ahead, giving her the gift of silence as she gathered her thoughts. The late afternoon sun painted the Colorado mountains in shades of purple and gold, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Sabrina felt something like peace settle over her heart. The wagon wheels creaked as Christian guided his team along the winding mountain trail. He'd helped Sabrina up onto the high seat with careful hands, noting how she trembled despite the warm afternoon sun. Now she sat beside him, hands folded tightly in her lap, shoulders curved inward as if to make herself smaller. The settlement fell away behind them as they climbed into the foothills. Stands of towering pines cast long shadows across their path, while patches of open valley showed the vastness of the Colorado wilderness stretching away on all sides. The only sounds were the steady clip-clop of hooves, the gentle squeak of leather harness, and Sabrina's occasional quiet sniffles. Christian kept his eyes on the trail, giving her the privacy to collect herself. He'd seen enough of life to know that sometimes silence was the kindest offering a body could make. Still, he couldn't help stealing glances at his unexpected passenger, noting how young she looked in the slanting sunlight. Too young to have endured what she'd faced today. The sun dipped lower as they wound their way up into the mountains, painting the sky in sheets of purple and gold. Sabrina watched the sunset with wide eyes, though Christian noticed she kept her head down whenever they passed other travelers on the road. Word would spread fast about what had happened in town. He'd have to figure out how to handle that, but for now, his main concern was getting her somewhere safe. "Not much further now," he said quietly, breaking their long silence as they rounded the final bend. His cabin came into view, sturdy log walls glowing amber in the last light of day. Smoke curled from the stone chimney. His neighbor Sam must have come by to light the hearth fire like he'd promised. Christian was grateful for it now. He drew the wagon to a halt near the cabin's front steps. Before he could move to help her, Sabrina had already gathered her skirts and climbed down on her own, though she wavered slightly on tired legs. The poor girl had been through enough today without him hovering over her. "Come on inside," he said, keeping his voice gentle. "We'll get some supper in you." The cabin's interior was simple but well kept. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Christian lit the oil lamp on the table, its warm glow making the space feel more welcoming. His wife Sarah had always said a lit lamp made any place feel more like home. The thought of Sarah gave him pause as he moved to the kitchen area. She'd been gone 3 years now, taken by fever despite his desperate efforts to save her. The cabin still held touches of her presence, the curtains she'd sewn, the wooden spoons she'd carved, the small room off the main living space where she'd kept her quilting supplies. Christian pushed the memories aside and focused on the practical task of preparing supper. He stirred up the banked coals in the cook stove and set about warming a pot of beans he'd made the day before. There was fresh cornbread, too, wrapped in a clean cloth. Sabrina stood uncertainly near the door until Christian gestured to one of the chairs at the simple wooden table. "Please, sit. Make yourself comfortable." She settled onto the chair like a sparrow lighting on a branch, ready to fly at the slightest disturbance. Christian served up 2 bowls of beans and cut thick slices of cornbread, setting them on the table without ceremony. "It's plain fare," he apologized, "but it's hot." "Thank you," Sabrina whispered. It was the first time she'd spoken since leaving town. She ate slowly, carefully, as if afraid to take too much. When the meal was finished, she rose quickly. "Please, let me wash the dishes." "It's the least I can do." Christian started to protest, but saw the determined set of her chin. Perhaps she needed to feel useful, to have some small way of contributing. He nodded. "Much obliged. Pump's right there by the sink." He sat in his chair by the fire, pretending to read, but actually watching as she methodically cleaned each dish and spoon. Her movements were practiced. Clearly she was used to keeping house. When she finished, she stood awkwardly, clearly unsure what to do next. Christian cleared his throat. "There's a small room just through that door," he said, gesturing to Sarah's old sewing room. "It's yours for as long as you need it. You'll be safe here. You have my word on that." Sabrina's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "Thank you, Mr. Christian. I don't know why you're being so kind to me, but thank you." "Just Christian is fine," he said, "and kindness don't need explaining. The room should be ready. My neighbor looks in on the place sometimes when I'm away, keeps it aired out." He showed her to the small room, where a narrow bed sat beneath a window. Sarah's quilting frame had been stored away, but one of her finished quilts still lay folded at the foot of the bed. The oil lamp from the table cast a warm glow over the simple space. "There's a wash basin on the stand," Christian said, "and extra blankets in the chest if you need them. I'll be out in the main room if you need anything. Door has a good strong latch." Sabrina nodded, fingers trailing over the quilt's careful stitching. "Good night," she whispered. "Good night," Christian replied, stepping out and closing the door behind him. He settled into his chair by the fire, listening to the small sounds of Sabrina moving about the room, the splash of water in the basin, the creak of bed springs, the soft rustle of blankets. Eventually, silence fell, broken only by the pop and crackle of the fire. Christian sat long into the night, staring into the flames. He knew the peace of this evening was temporary. Tomorrow would bring its own troubles. The town wouldn't let the matter of Sabrina rest easily. Her father's gambling debts would still need settling, and there would be talk about her staying here, unmarried, under his roof. He'd have to figure out how to protect her reputation while keeping her safe. But those were tomorrow's problems. For tonight, at least, she was safe and warm, with a full belly and a locked door between her and the world's cruelty. Christian added another log to the fire and settled deeper into his chair, prepared to keep watch through the night. In the small room, Sabrina curled up beneath Sarah's quilt, her exhausted body finally beginning to relax. The bed was soft, the room was warm, and for the first time in years she felt truly safe. The steady crackle of the fire and the quiet presence of her protector in the next room soothed her worried mind. Despite her fears about tomorrow, sleep came swiftly, drawing her down into peaceful darkness. Dawn broke over the mountain peaks, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds. Christian had risen early, tending to his morning chores, while letting Sabrina sleep. The poor girl needed her rest after yesterday's ordeal. When he heard movement in the small room, he put coffee on to boil and set about making a simple breakfast of flapjacks. Sabrina emerged looking slightly more composed than the day before, though her eyes still held shadows of worry. She'd smoothed her hair and straightened her dress as best she could. "Morning," Christian said, sliding a plate of flapjacks across the table. "We'll need to head into town for supplies today. You'll be wanting some things of your own, I expect." Sabrina's face paled slightly, but she nodded. "Yes, thank you. I have nothing with me." "Don't fret about the cost," Christian said, seeing her discomfort. "We'll get what you need." After breakfast, Christian harnessed his bay horse to the wagon while Sabrina washed the dishes. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and sage. As they set out, Christian noticed how Sabrina's shoulders tensed the closer they got to town. The settlement was already bustling when they arrived, dust rising from the main street as wagons and riders moved about their business. Christian helped Sabrina down from the wagon, conscious of the stares and whispers that followed them. He kept close to her side as they made their way toward the general store. They hadn't gone 10 paces when the saloon keeper stepped out of his establishment, blocking their path. His fancy vest gleamed with watch chains, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Well now, if it ain't the happy couple," he drawled, tipping his hat mockingly. "Though I seem to recall the lady was promised elsewhere." "Got papers saying her father's debts transfer to me, including any property or persons under his control." Christian stepped forward, placing himself between Sabrina and the saloon keeper. "Miss Sabrina ain't property to be traded, and she's under my protection now." "Protection, is it?" The saloon keeper's voice dripped with insinuation. "Mighty convenient arrangement you've got there. But a debt's a debt, and I mean to collect what's owed." "You'll collect nothing from her," Christian said firmly, his hand resting near his belt. "Best move along now." A small crowd had gathered, watching the confrontation with keen interest. The saloon keeper's face darkened, but before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Brothers, let us not forget the Lord's teachings about proper conduct." The preacher stepped forward, his worn Bible clutched in one hand. He was a tall man with graying hair and stern features softened by kind eyes. "These young people need guidance, not confrontation," the preacher continued. He turned to Christian and Sabrina. "Though I understand your intentions were honorable, you must see how this arrangement appears to others. A young woman living unmarried under a man's roof. It isn't right. Her reputation will suffer." Sabrina's face flamed red, and she stared at the ground. Christian felt anger rising in his chest at her humiliation. "Our arrangement is temporary," he said curtly. "Miss Sabrina needed help, and I provided it. Nothing improper about that." The preacher shook his head. "The world isn't always charitable in its judgments. Marriage would protect her honor and silence these whispers." "We've heard enough," Christian said firmly. He placed a gentle hand on Sabrina's elbow. "Come on, we've got supplies to buy." They left the gathered crowd behind, but Christian could hear the whispers following them like shadows. In the general store, he helped Sabrina select some basic necessities, a few simple dresses, undergarments, a brush, and other personal items. She tried to choose the cheapest options, but Christian insisted on quality goods that would last. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts as the sun began its westward slide. Christian couldn't shake the memory of the saloon keeper's threats or the preacher's well-meaning but uncomfortable suggestions. As they unloaded the wagon, Sabrina carried her new belongings into the small room. Christian was stacking firewood when he heard her sharp gasp. He hurried inside to find her sitting on the bed, holding a worn Bible in trembling hands. "I found it in the dresser drawer," she whispered. It was my mother's. I thought Father had sold it with everything else." Christian watched as she carefully opened the Bible's cracked leather cover. Her fingers traced the faded inscription inside, and tears welled in her eyes. "She used to read to me from this every night," Sabrina said softly. "Before she passed." As she turned the pages, a folded paper slipped from between them, falling to the floor. Christian bent to retrieve it, but not before he saw the official seal and legal writing. Sabrina unfolded the document with shaking fingers. Her eyes widened as she read. It's a deed," she breathed. "Mother left me land." 20 acres bordering the North Creek. She looked up at Christian in wonder. "I had no idea. Father never said." Christian's mind was working quickly. The North Creek formed the main water source for his ranch, flowing down from the mountains across his neighbor's land. 20 acres along that creek would be valuable property indeed. "Your father knew," he said grimly. "Must be why he was so set on." He stopped, not wanting to finish the thought. Sabrina's face had gone pale again. The saloon keeper. He must know too. That's why he wants... She clutched the deed to her chest, looking up at Christian with frightened eyes. The sunset painted the cabin walls in deep gold as they sat in heavy silence, both understanding how much higher the stakes had just become. The deed in Sabrina's hands wasn't just paper. It was power, protection, and perhaps the real reason behind her father's desperate actions. Christian watched as Sabrina carefully folded the deed and placed it back in her mother's Bible. Her hands were steady now, though her face showed the strain of these revelations. The last rays of sunlight streamed through the window, catching the tears that slipped down her cheeks. Morning light crept through the cabin windows, bringing with it a crisp mountain breeze that rustled the curtains. Christian had been up since before dawn, his routine unchanged despite their unusual circumstances. He paused in his morning chores, watching as Sabrina emerged from her room, already dressed and eager to be useful. "Good morning," she said softly, smoothing her skirts. I'd like to help if you'll show me how." Christian nodded, appreciating her initiative. "Reckon we can start with the basics. Chickens need feeding, water needs fetching, and the porch could use a sweep." He showed her to the feed barrel, demonstrating how much to scatter for the chickens. Sabrina watched intently, her round face serious with concentration. When she took the feed bucket, some grain spilled through her nervous fingers, but she quickly adjusted her grip. "Like this?" she asked, tossing feed in a careful arc. "That's right," Christian confirmed. "They'll come running when they hear the grain hit the ground." Sure enough, chickens emerged from all directions, clucking and pecking. A smile touched Sabrina's lips as they gathered around her feet, and Christian noticed how it softened her face. Next came the water fetching. Christian handed her 2 wooden buckets, showing her the path to the creek. "Mind the rocks," he cautioned. "They get slippery." Sabrina's first trip was slow and careful. Water sloshed over the rim with each step, and she had to stop several times to rest her arms. But she persisted, determined to complete the task without complaint. By her 3rd trip, she had found a rhythm, though her face was flushed with effort. The morning wore on as Christian taught her other simple tasks. She stumbled occasionally, unused to physical labor, but her determination never wavered. When he handed her the broom for the porch, she tackled the job with the same quiet resolve she'd shown all morning. "You're doing fine," Christian said, noticing how she straightened at the praise. It reminded him of teaching his late wife the ways of ranch life, though he quickly pushed that thought aside. As afternoon approached, Sabrina hesitantly asked permission to prepare their evening meal. "I saw the venison in your storehouse," she said. "I know how to make a proper stew if you'd allow it." Christian agreed, watching from the corner of his eye as she gathered ingredients. Her movements in the kitchen grew more confident as she worked, chopping vegetables and measuring seasonings with careful precision. The cabin slowly filled with the rich aroma of simmering meat and herbs. When supper time arrived, Sabrina ladled the stew into bowls with obvious pride. Steam rose from the thick broth, carrying the promise of a hearty meal. Christian took his first spoonful and nodded appreciatively. "This is right tasty," he said, reaching for a second helping. "You've got a good hand with seasoning." Sabrina's face lit up at the compliment, a shy smile playing at her lips. It was the first real smile he'd seen from her since she'd arrived, and it transformed her entire countenance. She ducked her head, pleased but modest. "My mother taught me," she said softly, "before she passed. She always said a good meal could make a house feel more like home." They ate in comfortable silence, the tension of previous days easing somewhat. Christian noticed how Sabrina sat straighter in her chair, no longer hunched with uncertainty. Contributing to the household had given her a measure of dignity she'd been missing. After the dishes were cleaned and put away, Christian retrieved a worn saddle strap from his workbench. The leather needed mending before it could be trusted again. He was about to begin when he noticed Sabrina watching with interest. "Would you like to learn?" he asked, surprising himself with the offer. She nodded eagerly, pulling her chair closer to the lamp's warm glow. Christian demonstrated how to punch the holes, thread the leather strips, and tie the proper knots. His large hands moved with practiced ease, while Sabrina leaned in to study each step. "Here," he said, handing her a piece of scrap leather. "You try." Her first attempts were clumsy, the stitches uneven. But Christian showed patience he didn't know he possessed, guiding her hands when needed and offering quiet encouragement. Gradually, her movements became more sure, the stitches straighter. The lamp burned low as they worked, casting long shadows on the cabin walls. Outside, the night had settled deep and still, broken only by the occasional yip of coyotes in the distance. Their wild songs floated across the starlit valley, a reminder of the untamed world beyond their door. Finally, Sabrina completed her section of mending. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold. She ran her fingers over the stitches, satisfaction evident in her expression. "Thank you for teaching me," she whispered, stifling a yawn. "And for everything." Christian nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He watched as she rose and made her way to her room, her steps lighter than they'd been that morning. The door closed softly behind her, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He remained by the dying fire, troubled by the warmth that had grown between them throughout the day. It wasn't right to feel this way, not with all the uncertainty surrounding their situation. The deed hidden in her mother's Bible complicated matters further, and the threats from town still loomed. More coyotes called in the darkness, their voices rising and falling like questions without answers. Christian added another log to the fire, watching the flames catch and grow. The evening's peace felt fragile, temporary, yet he couldn't deny the comfort he'd found in sharing his home and knowledge with someone again, and having a purpose beyond his daily routine. The fire crackled softly, throwing shadows that danced across the rough-hewn walls. Christian sat long into the night, listening to the wild song of the coyotes and wondering what tomorrow would bring to their precarious arrangement. A week passed, like water flowing in the creek, steady and sure. Each sunrise brought new tasks, and each sunset found Sabrina more capable than before. Her hands grew calloused from ranch work, her movements more confident as she learned the rhythms of country life. The afternoon sun hung low in the western sky when Christian hitched up his horse, preparing to ride out to check the fence line. Storm damage had weakened several posts, and they needed mending before any cattle could stray. "I'll be back before dark," he said, adjusting his tool belt. "Keep the door latched." Sabrina nodded from the porch, where she was shelling peas into a wooden bowl. "I'll have supper waiting," she promised, her voice steady with newfound assurance. Christian touched the brim of his hat and rode out, following the fence line that stretched toward the darkening timber. Sabrina watched until he disappeared around the bend, then returned to her task, humming softly as she worked. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Sabrina had just put a pot of beans on to simmer when she heard it, a sound that made her blood run cold. A child's cry, high and frightened, coming from the direction of the timber. She rushed to the window, straining to hear. There it came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable howl of wolves. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she spotted movement at the edge of the trees. A small figure stumbling through the gathering dusk, with dark shapes slinking behind. Fear urged her to bar the door and wait for Christian's return. But that cry came again, desperate now, and something inside her shifted. Without stopping to think, she grabbed the iron lantern from its hook and Christian's woodpile axe. Her hands trembled as she lit the lantern, but her voice was firm as she whispered a quick prayer. Sabrina burst out the door, holding the lantern high. "Hello," she called out, trying to keep the shake from her voice. "This way." "Run toward the light." A boy, no more than 7 years old, emerged from the shadows. His face was streaked with tears and dirt, his clothes torn from pushing through brush. Behind him, yellow eyes gleamed in the growing darkness. 5 wolves, their gray forms ghost-like in the dim light. "Keep moving toward me," Sabrina commanded, surprising herself with the authority in her tone. She grabbed a piece of firewood from the pile near the porch, holding it like a torch alongside the lantern. The boy stumbled forward as the wolves spread out in a half-circle, their low growls raising the hair on Sabrina's neck. One wolf, larger than the others, took a step forward, lips pulled back to reveal gleaming teeth. Sabrina's hands shook, but her voice rang out strong and clear. "Get back." She swung the lantern in a wide arc, then thrust the piece of firewood toward the nearest wolf. The predators hesitated, unused to such fierce resistance from what should have been easy prey. The boy reached her side, pressing against her skirts and sobbing. Sabrina wrapped one arm around his shoulders while keeping the lantern moving, creating a barrier of light between them and the wolves. "It's all right," she murmured to the child. "We're going to back up slow and steady." Step by careful step, they retreated toward the cabin. The wolves followed, but maintained their distance, confused by the swinging light and Sabrina's continued shouts. Just as her arm began to tire from holding the lantern, hoofbeats thundered across the yard. Christian galloped into view, rifle raised. He fired a warning shot into the air, and the wolves scattered, melting back into the timber like smoke. In moments, the yard was clear, except for the lingering echo of the gunshot. Sabrina's knees went weak with relief as Christian dismounted. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice gruff with concern as he strode towards them. "We're all right," she managed, still holding the trembling boy close. "Just scared is all." Christian knelt down to the boy's level. "What's your name, son?" "Tommy Wilson," the child hiccuped. "I got lost looking for our cow." She broke through the fence, and Paws laid up with a broken leg, so I thought. His voice trailed off into fresh tears. "The Wilson place is 3 miles east," Christian said, straightening up. "They must be worried sick. I'll ride over and let them know he's safe." "No need," a woman's voice called out. They turned to see a wagon approaching, driven by a teenage boy with a woman beside him. "Tommy." "Oh, thank the Lord." The woman, Tommy's mother, leaped down before the wagon fully stopped, running to gather her son in her arms. "We've been searching everywhere." When we heard the gunshot, she looked up at Sabrina, eyes brimming with tears. "You saved my boy." "Those wolves would have." She couldn't finish the sentence, just hugged Tommy tighter. "Miss Sabrina drove them off with nothing but a lantern and her courage," Christian said quietly, and Sabrina felt her cheeks warm at the respect in his voice. Tommy's older brother helped his mother and Tommy into the wagon, both of them thanking Sabrina repeatedly. As they drove away, Mrs. Wilson called back, "We'll tell everyone what you did. Such bravery deserves to be known." Silence settled over the yard as the wagon disappeared into the darkness. Sabrina still held the lantern, its flame steady now that her hands had stopped shaking. She looked up to find Christian watching her with an expression she'd never seen before, something like wonder mixed with admiration. "Supper's probably scorched," she said softly, suddenly shy under his gaze. "Doesn't matter," Christian replied, taking the lantern from her and hanging it back on its hook. "Come on inside. You must be exhausted." They sat down to slightly overcooked beans and cornbread, but neither seemed to mind. Christian served her first, his movements deliberate and respectful. When he spoke, his voice was gentle. "What you did today, that took real courage." Sabrina ducked her head, but not from shame this time. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, she felt truly proud of herself. "I couldn't let those wolves get him," she said simply. "It wasn't even a choice, really." "No," Christian agreed. "I reckon it wasn't. Not for someone with a heart like yours." They finished their meal in comfortable silence, the lamplight warm against the cabin walls. Outside, a lone wolf howled in the distance, but Sabrina didn't feel afraid anymore. She had faced down her fears and found strength she never knew she possessed. As she cleared the dishes, her movements were sure and steady, matched by the quiet pride glowing in her heart. Saturday morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of autumn day that painted the Colorado mountains in rich golds and crimsons. Christian's wagon rolled steadily toward town, the wooden wheels crunching over scattered pine needles. Sabrina sat beside him on the rough bench, her market basket filled with eggs and butter to trade. The familiar knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach as the first buildings came into view. But something felt different today. The way Christian had positioned himself, solid and steady beside her, reminded her that she wasn't alone anymore. "Reckon we'll need some coffee and sugar," Christian said, pulling the wagon to a stop near the general store. "And maybe some of that peppermint candy you like." His quiet thoughtfulness brought a smile to Sabrina's face. The market square bustled with activity. Traders had set up wooden stalls displaying everything from root vegetables to handmade quilts. The morning sun warmed the dusty ground, carrying the mingled scents of fresh bread and leather goods. Sabrina noticed the whispers starting as soon as she climbed down from the wagon. But these weren't the cruel murmurs she'd grown accustomed to. Instead, she caught fragments of conversation that made her pause. "That's the girl who saved Tommy Wilson. Drove off 5 wolves with nothing but a lantern. Braver than half the men in town, I'd say." Mrs. Peterson, who had once pointedly turned away when Sabrina passed, now approached with a warm smile. "My Tommy hasn't stopped talking about how you saved him," she said, pressing Sabrina's hand. "We're blessed to have such a courageous neighbor." Sabrina's cheeks flushed at the praise. "Anyone would have done the same," she murmured. "No," Mrs. Peterson said firmly. "Not anyone would have. It takes real spirit to face down wolves in the dark." More women gathered around, offering words of admiration and gratitude. Sabrina found herself drawn into conversations about ranch life and Christian's kindness. For the first time, they looked at her face instead of her size, spoke to her instead of about her. Near the edge of the market, beneath a canvas awning, sat a striking woman with long black hair braided with leather strips. Her trade blanket displayed neat rows of dried herbs and medicine bundles. Several settlers stood nearby, waiting to exchange goods for her renowned remedies. "That's Nalin," Christian explained quietly. "She knows more about healing plants than anyone in the territory. Saved my best horse last spring with her medicines." Sabrina watched as Nalin conducted her trades with quiet dignity, speaking both English and Comanche as needed. There was something compelling about her presence, a sense of being completely at peace with who she was. As the morning wore on, Sabrina found herself drifting toward Nalin's stall. The Comanche woman looked up, her dark eyes keen and knowing. "You are the one who faced the wolves," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am," Sabrina replied softly. Nalin studied her for a long moment. "My people know that true strength comes from here." She touched her chest, over her heart. "You carry strength of spirit, not weakness of flesh. The wolves saw this too, that is why they retreated." Sabrina felt tears prick at her eyes. All her life, people had defined her by her size, as if the shape of her body determined the worth of her soul. But this woman saw deeper, past the surface to something essential within. "Thank you," Sabrina whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Nalin nodded, then selected a small leather pouch from her blanket. "Mint and sage," she explained, pressing it into Sabrina's hands, "for clear thoughts and brave hearts. No payment needed. It is a gift between strong women." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of trading and conversation. When Christian and Sabrina finally loaded their purchases into the wagon, the sun had passed its peak. Dark clouds were gathering in the west, promising rain. They made it back to the ranch just as the first heavy drops began to fall. Christian hurried to stable the horses, while Sabrina carried their goods inside. Soon, a steady rhythm of rain drummed against the cabin's roof, creating a cozy barrier between them and the world outside. Christian built up the fire, its warmth pushing back the damp chill. Sabrina set about preparing their evening meal, moving with new confidence in the familiar space. The sound of rain and the crackle of burning wood filled the comfortable silence between them. After supper, they remained by the fire, listening to the storm. Sabrina held Nyland's gift of herbs, inhaling their fresh, clean scent. Something about the day's events had loosened a knot inside her, making it easier to speak what was in her heart. "All my life," she began softly, "people have looked at me and seen only one thing: my size, as if that's all I am." She traced the stitching on the herb pouch with her finger. "Even my father, especially my father. He made me feel like a burden, something to be rid of." Christian shifted in his chair, his expression troubled in the firelight. "Your father's a fool," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "And so's anyone else who can't see past the surface." "When I first asked you to help me," Sabrina continued, "I thought you might laugh like the others." "But you didn't," You just helped." She looked up at him. "Why?" Christian was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "Because I recognized something in your eyes," he finally said. "Something that reminded me of my Sarah. Not in looks, but in spirit. She never let anyone tell her what she couldn't do either." He cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with such personal talk, but pressing on. "These past weeks you've surprised me. Your kindness with the animals, your willingness to learn, the way you faced down those wolves without thinking of yourself." He met her gaze directly. "That's real grit, Sabrina. And it's worth more than any measure of size or shape." Sabrina felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. For the first time in her life, someone was seeing her, truly seeing her, for who she was inside. The rain continued its gentle pattern on the roof as they sat in companionable silence, each lost in thought, but somehow closer than before. The herbs Nalin had given her released their sweet, sharp scent into the warm air. Mint for clear thoughts, sage for brave hearts. Sabrina smiled, feeling both clearer and braver than she had in years. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was beginning to believe she had the strength to face them. The Sunday evening sky painted streaks of pink and gold across the horizon as Christian's wagon approached the white-painted church. Lantern light spilled from its windows, and the sound of a fiddle tuning up drifted through the early autumn air. Sabrina sat quietly beside Christian, her hands twisting the fabric of her freshly pressed dress, her mother's, carefully altered. Christian pulled the wagon to a stop beside several others. He could feel Sabrina's tension as she stared at the church steps where small groups of townspeople gathered, chatting and laughing. The social was a monthly tradition, bringing the scattered community together for music, food, and fellowship. "We don't have to stay long," Christian said softly, helping her down from the wagon. The leather of his best boots creaked. He had polished them specially for the occasion, though he would never admit it. Sabrina's feet seemed rooted to the packed earth at the bottom of the church steps. Through the open door, she could see ladies arranging pies on long tables, their colorful skirts swishing as they moved. The fiddle player drew his bow across the strings, testing the tune. Everything looked warm and inviting, yet Sabrina remembered too well the cruel laughter that had followed her through these same streets mere weeks ago. Christian gently touched her elbow. "Shall we?" he asked, offering his arm. The simple gesture carried strength, reminding her she wasn't alone anymore. Taking a deep breath, Sabrina slipped her hand into the crook of his arm. Together they climbed the steps and crossed the threshold into the lamp-lit church. Heads turned as they entered. Sabrina felt her cheeks warm, but the expected whispers and sneers didn't come. Instead, Mrs. Peterson smiled and waved from near the pie table. The Wilson boy, whom Sabrina had saved from the wolves, tugged at his mother's skirt and pointed excitedly. "Evening, Christian," called Mr. Barnes, the blacksmith. "Fine night for a social, ain't it?" Christian nodded, guiding Sabrina toward an empty bench along the wall. The familiar scents of coffee, fresh-baked pies, and beeswax candles filled the air. The fiddle player launched into a lively reel, and several couples took to the cleared space in the center of the room. "Would you like some coffee?" Christian asked. When Sabrina nodded, he made his way to the refreshment table, returning with 2 steaming cups and plates bearing slices of apple pie. They sat together, watching the dancers and listening to the music. Sabrina found herself tapping her foot to the rhythm, remembering how her mother used to hum while working around their old cabin. The memory brought a smile instead of the usual ache. As the evening progressed, more people stopped by their bench to chat. The conversation was simple: talk of weather and crops, compliments on pies and preserves, but the simple normalcy of it felt like a gift. No one stared at Sabrina's size or made cutting remarks. She was just another neighbor at the social. The fiddle player switched to a slower tune, one that floated through the room like honey. Christian shifted in his seat, then surprised himself by standing and turning to Sabrina. "Would you care to dance?" he asked, his voice gruff with unexpected nervousness. Sabrina's eyes widened. "Oh, I don't know how," she stammered. "Neither do I, truth be told," Christian admitted with a small smile. "But we could learn together." Heart pounding, Sabrina placed her hand in his. Christian led her to the dance floor, placing one hand carefully at her waist while holding her other hand in his. "I reckon we just move with the music," he said softly. Their first steps were awkward, both trying not to tread on the other's feet. But gradually they found their rhythm. Christian's hand was warm and steady at her waist, his presence solid and reassuring as they turned slowly to the music. Sabrina couldn't help the smile that spread across her face. For the first time in her life, she wasn't thinking about her size or what others might be saying. She was simply dancing with a good man who had chosen to ask her, who looked at her with genuine warmth in his eyes. The lamplight cast a golden glow over everything, making the moment feel almost magical. Other couples danced around them, but Sabrina barely noticed. In that precious span of time, she felt beautiful. Not because anything about her had changed, but because someone had seen worth in her just as she was. As the music drew to a close, the preacher stepped to the front of the room. The dancers returned to their seats, and a comfortable hush fell over the gathering. The preacher's weathered face was kind as he surveyed his congregation. "Tonight I want to speak about something that's been on my heart," he began, his deep voice carrying to every corner of the room. In 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 7, the Lord says to Samuel, "Look not on his countenance, or on the height of his stature, for the Lord seeth not as man seeth. For man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart." Sabrina felt tears prick at her eyes as the preacher continued. Too often, we judge by what our eyes see. We miss the truth that every soul carries God's image. Every heart holds infinite worth. The Lord doesn't measure us by the standards of this world. He looks deeper, to the spirit within. Christian's hand found Sabrina's and squeezed gently. She squeezed back, her heart so full it felt like it might overflow. "Let us be more like our Father," the preacher concluded. "Let us look past the surface to see the divine spark in each person we meet. For in God's eyes, every soul is precious, every life a masterpiece of His creation." After the sermon, people began gathering their things to leave. The night air had grown cool when Christian and Sabrina stepped outside. Stars sparkled overhead, and a crescent moon hung like a silver smile in the dark sky. The ride home was peaceful. Sabrina hummed softly, one of the tunes from The Social, while Christian guided the horses along the familiar road. The rhythm of hooves and wagon wheels provided a gentle accompaniment to her melody. Back at the ranch, Christian helped her down from the wagon one last time. They stood for a moment in the yard, neither quite ready to end the evening. "Thank you," Sabrina said softly. "For tonight. For the dance. For—" She gestured vaguely, encompassing everything he had done for her. Christian nodded, understanding what she couldn't quite put into words. "You're welcome," he replied simply. Sabrina continued humming as she climbed the porch steps and entered the cabin. The tune followed her inside, a sweet reminder of an evening she would never forget. The night she had felt, truly felt, that she belonged. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Christian's ranch as dark clouds gathered on the horizon. 3 rough-looking men lounged against the fence posts near the gate, their horses tied nearby. They had appeared 2 days ago, smoking and spitting, watching the ranch with predatory eyes. Sabrina's hands trembled as she gathered eggs from the henhouse. One of the men whistled sharply, making her jump. She clutched her basket closer and hurried back to the cabin, careful not to meet their gaze. Inside, she found Christian studying papers spread across the kitchen table, his jaw tight with worry. He quickly gathered them up when she entered, but not before she glimpsed official-looking stamps and signatures. "Found these tacked to the gate this morning," he said gruffly. "Seems the saloon keeper's gotten himself some fancy paperwork claiming rights to your mother's land." He paused, running a hand through his hair. "And somehow he's tied it to my water rights, too." Sabrina set the egg basket down carefully, her stomach knotting. "But that's not possible. The deed was my mother's. It's legal and true." "Legal papers can be forged," Christian said, his voice heavy. "And the saloon keeper's got friends in county offices who'll swear to whatever he wants, long as the price is right." Thunder rolled in the distance as Sabrina began preparing their evening meal. She moved mechanically through the familiar tasks, peeling potatoes, slicing salt pork, setting water to boil. Her mind churned with worry about the men outside and the threat to both their lands. Christian paced the cabin, checking the windows periodically. The hired men's presence clearly unsettled him. They both knew these weren't ordinary cowboys. They were the kind of men who solved problems with violence, hired by those with coin and cruel intentions. As dusk approached, Sabrina set 2 bowls of stew on the table. Christian sat down, but barely touched his food, lost in thought. She was about to clear the dishes when she heard him talking softly to himself, not realizing she could hear. "Can't keep her here," he muttered, staring into his cooling stew. "Too dangerous now. Them men out there, they ain't leaving. Keeping her close is putting us both at risk." The words hit Sabrina like a physical blow. Her throat tightened as she understood. She had become a burden, a source of danger to the man who had shown her kindness. Of course he would want her gone. Who wouldn't? She was nothing but trouble, just as her father had always said. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the cabin in stark white for a moment. Sabrina turned away quickly, not wanting Christian to see the tears welling in her eyes. "I think I'll turn in early," she managed to say, her voice barely steady. "Been a long day." "Sabrina?" Christian called after her, perhaps hearing something in her tone, but she was already closing the door to her small room. In the sanctuary of her bedroom, Sabrina pressed her face into the pillow to muffle her sobs. The thunder grew louder outside, matching her turbulent emotions. After everything, the dance at the social, the growing respect from townspeople, learning to be useful around the ranch, she had foolishly begun to hope she might have found a real home here. But now the truth was clear. Christian had only ever meant to help temporarily, and she had overstayed her welcome. Her presence was putting him in danger, threatening the land and water rights he depended on. The saloon keeper's men lounging by the gate were a constant reminder of the trouble she had brought to Christian's doorstep. Rain began to fall, pattering against the window glass. Sabrina sat up in bed, wiping her eyes with trembling hands. Through the thin walls, she could hear Christian moving around in the main room, his steady footsteps, the scrape of his chair, the soft thud of firewood being added to the stove. Familiar sounds that had come to mean safety and home to her, but would soon be just memories. A particularly loud crack of thunder made the cabin shudder. In the brief silence that followed, she heard Christian sigh heavily. The sound carried such weariness that fresh tears spilled down Sabrina's cheeks. This good man had risked everything to help her. And how had she repaid him? By bringing danger and strife to his peaceful ranch. She thought of the deed hidden away in her mother's Bible, the document that was causing so much trouble. Perhaps if she simply gave it to the saloon keeper, he would leave Christian alone. The thought of surrendering her mother's final gift made her heart ache. But wasn't it better than being the cause of Christian losing everything he had worked for? Lightning flashed again, and in its brief illumination, Sabrina caught sight of her reflection in the small mirror on the wall. The face that looked back at her was tear-stained, but no longer that of the frightened girl who had begged a stranger for help outside a saloon. These past weeks had changed her, taught her that she had value beyond what others saw on the surface. But that growth had come at a cost, one that Christian was now paying. His muttered words echoed in her mind. Can't keep her here. Too dangerous now. The truth of them settled like a weight in her chest. She had to leave, before her presence brought more trouble to this man who had already done so much for her. Outside, the storm grew fiercer. Wind rattled the window panes and rain drummed against the roof. Sabrina huddled under her quilt, listening to the wild weather and trying to quiet her racing thoughts. But sleep remained elusive as her mind spun with fears and regrets. In the main room, Christian's footsteps continued their restless pattern. She imagined him worried about the men outside, about the forged documents, about the water rights his ranch depended on. All because he had shown kindness to a desperate girl who had no right to ask so much of him. The storm showed no signs of lessening as the night wore on. Neither did the ache in Sabrina's heart as she lay awake, feeling more unwanted than ever. Tomorrow she would have to face what Christian's words meant, that her brief taste of belonging had come to an end. Thunder rolled again, closer now, like the approaching footsteps of fate. In its rumble, Sabrina heard echoes of the cruel laughter that had followed her all her life. She pulled the quilt tighter around herself, trying to hold on to the warmth of the home she would soon have to leave. The pale light of dawn had barely begun to streak the sky when Sabrina eased her door open. Her heart thundered in her chest as she crept through the quiet cabin. Christian's soft snores drifted from his room. He had fallen asleep late after hours of restless pacing. She placed a folded note on the kitchen table, her hands trembling. The simple words thanked him for his kindness and apologized for the trouble she had brought. In her mother's Bible, she had tucked the deed to her land. Let Christian use it to save his water rights. It was the least she could do. From the pantry, she took only a small loaf of bread and a few dried apples. Enough for a day's journey, but not so much that Christian would miss them. She wrapped these in a cloth and tucked them into the pockets of her heaviest dress. Over her shoulders, she draped the woolen blanket from her bed. The morning air bit sharp and cold when she stepped outside. Dark clouds loomed on the horizon, promising snow. Sabrina pulled the blanket tighter and started walking, not daring to look back at the cabin that had briefly felt like home. She headed toward the mountains, where the rising slopes were thick with pine trees. If she could make it over the first ridge, perhaps she could find work in one of the mining towns. Anywhere would do, as long as it was far from the troubles she had brought to Christian's door. The first snowflakes began to fall as she climbed higher. They were small and dry at first, dancing in the strengthening wind. Sabrina kept moving, though her legs already ached from the steep terrain. The bread and apples remained untouched in her pocket. Her stomach was too knotted with grief to eat. Back at the ranch, Christian woke to silence. The usual sounds of Sabrina starting breakfast were missing. He dressed quickly, worry gnawing at him after the previous day's threats. When he found her room empty and saw the note, his hands shook as he read it. "No," he whispered, real fear gripping him. He rushed outside to check the barn, calling her name. Fresh tracks in the dusting of snow led away from the cabin, toward the mountains. The sight of those small footprints disappearing into the wilderness made his heart clench. Snow was falling steadily now as Christian saddled his horse. He worked with swift, efficient movements born of years of experience, though his mind raced with fear. The temperature was dropping fast, and Sabrina was out there alone, thinking he wanted her gone. "Fool woman," he muttered, but the words held more anguish than anger. "Why didn't you let me explain?" He mounted and urged his horse forward, following Sabrina's tracks while they were still visible. The snow was falling thicker now, threatening to obscure her trail. Christian's throat tightened as he thought of her trudging alone into this weather, believing herself unwanted. Higher in the mountains, Sabrina struggled against the strengthening storm. The wind cut through her blanket, and snow had soaked into her shoes. Her toes had gone numb, and her legs trembled with each step. Still, she pushed forward, though she could barely see through the swirling white. "Just keep moving," she gasped, but her words were lost in the wind. The cold had worked its way into her bones, making every movement a battle. When she stumbled over a hidden root, her legs finally gave way. She fell into the deep snow, the last of her strength seeping away. As consciousness began to fade, Sabrina thought she heard someone calling her name. But that was impossible. No one would be looking for her. No one would miss her. The sound must be the wind playing tricks. Her eyes drifted closed as numbness crept through her body. Christian's voice grew hoarse from shouting against the storm. The horse plowed steadily through deepening snow, but Sabrina's tracks had vanished. Fear clawed at his chest as he searched the white landscape. How long had she been out in this cold? How much time did she have left? Then he saw it. A dark shape huddled in the snow beneath a pine tree. His heart nearly stopped. "Sabrina!" He leaped from the saddle, stumbling through drifts to reach her. She lay curled on her side, her skin pale as the snow around her. When he touched her cheek, it was ice cold. "No," Christian growled, gathering her limp form in his arms. "I won't lose you too." "Not like this." He lifted her against his chest, her head lolling against his shoulder. She felt so small, so fragile in his embrace. With precious care, he mounted his horse, holding Sabrina secure against him. She stirred slightly, a weak moan escaping her blue-tinged lips. Christian wrapped his heavy coat around them both and turned the horse toward home. "Stay with me," he whispered fiercely, urging his mount to greater speed. "I never meant for you to leave. Those men, the threats, I was trying to protect you, not send you away." The journey back seemed endless. Christian felt every shallow breath Sabrina took, each one a small victory against the cold trying to claim her. He kept talking, his voice rough with emotion, telling her everything he should have said before. "You brought life back to my home," he said, ducking against the wind. "I'd forgotten what it was like having someone to care for. Someone who needed me." His arms tightened around her still form. "I reckon I needed you too." Finally, the cabin came into view through the curtain of snow. Christian's hands were nearly frozen around the reins, but he didn't feel the cold. All that mattered was getting Sabrina warm and safe. He carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the storm. With gentle movements, he laid her on the bed closest to the stove and quickly built up the fire. Her skin remained frighteningly cold as he wrapped her in every blanket he could find. "Come back to me," he pleaded, chafing her icy hands between his own. "I've got so much to tell you, if you'll just open your eyes." Slowly, terribly slowly, warmth began to return to Sabrina's body. Color crept back into her cheeks, and her breathing grew stronger. When her eyelids finally fluttered open, Christian felt tears of relief sting his eyes. "Tian?" Her voice was barely a whisper, confusion clouding her gaze. "I'm here," he said hoarsely, still holding her hand. "And I'm not letting you go again." Sabrina tried to speak, but he gently hushed her. "Rest now. We'll talk when you're stronger." He brushed a strand of damp hair from her forehead, his touch infinitely tender. "Just know that this is where you belong. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin something fragile and precious had been saved from breaking. Christian settled into the chair beside Sabrina's bed, prepared to watch over her through the long hours ahead. His heart was heavy with the knowledge that his own fears and silence had nearly cost him everything that mattered. Christian carried Sabrina's limp form through the cabin door, kicking it shut against the howling wind. Snow melted from his shoulders as he crossed to the stone fireplace with quick, urgent steps. The flames had died low during his absence, leaving only glowing embers that cast weak shadows on the log walls. "Hold on," he murmured, easing Sabrina onto the bearskin rug before the hearth. Her skin felt like ice beneath his touch, her lips tinged an alarming blue. Working swiftly, Christian added kindling and logs until the fire roared back to life, throwing welcome heat across them both. He stripped off her snow-soaked outer clothes with trembling hands, wrapping her in warm blankets from his bed. Her body shivered violently, a good sign he knew from mountain winters, but it pained him to watch her suffer. So cold, Sabrina stuttered through chattering teeth. Her eyes fluttered open, clouded with confusion and lingering hurt. Why? Why did you come after me? Christian's heart clenched at the genuine bewilderment in her voice. He began rubbing her arms through the blankets, trying to restore circulation. Because you belong here, he said roughly. I never meant for you to think otherwise. But I heard you. Her words broke off as another shiver racked her frame. You said keeping me was dangerous. I didn't want to be more trouble. Christian's hands stilled on her arms. Oh, lass. He drew a ragged breath. Those weren't your troubles. They were mine. I was worried about failing you, about not being able to protect you proper-like. Sabrina's eyes widened slightly at his admission. Christian forced himself to continue, knowing she needed to hear the full truth. After Margaret died, he swallowed hard. After I lost my wife, I swore I'd never let anyone else depend on me. Couldn't bear the thought of failing someone that way again. His voice grew hoarse. But then you came along, needing shelter, and something in me couldn't turn away. These past weeks, watching you find your place here, seeing your strength, it scared me how much I'd come to care. Tears welled in Sabrina's eyes, spilling down her cold, flushed cheeks. I thought I was just a burden, someone you felt obliged to help. No. Christian's denial came swift and fierce. He gathered her closer, blankets and all, until she was cradled against his chest. You brought life back to this empty house. Made it a home again. When I saw your tracks leading into that storm. His arms tightened around her. I've never been so frightened. Sabrina pressed her face into his shoulder, her tears soaking through his shirt. I was so alone before, she whispered. Papa gambling away everything Mama left, treating me like property to be sold. When you stood up for me that day, it felt like a miracle, but I kept waiting for you to realize I wasn't worth the trouble. Look at me, Christian said softly. When she raised her tear-stained face, he cupped her cheek in his calloused palm. You're worth everything. The trouble, the risk, all of it. I'm just sorry my own fears made you doubt that. Fresh tears spilled over his hand. Promise? She asked, voice small and wondering. Promise I can stay? As long as you want, Christian vowed. This is your home now. Whatever comes, land disputes, your father's schemes, the whole town's gossip, we'll face it together. Something tight and painful in Sabrina's chest began to loosen at his words. The cold that had seemed bone-deep started to fade, replaced by spreading warmth that had nothing to do with the fire or blankets. Christian shrugged out of his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, adding its familiar warmth to her cocoon of blankets. The leather still held the scent of pine and horses that she'd come to associate with safety. Rest now, he murmured, settling her more comfortably against him. You're home. Sabrina's eyes grew heavy as exhaustion caught up with her. The steady beat of Christian's heart beneath her ear and the crackle of the fire created a soothing rhythm. For the first time since her mother died, she felt truly secure, truly wanted. Thank you, she whispered, already drifting. For finding me. Christian's arms tightened briefly around her. Always will, he promised quietly. Outside, the storm raged on, rattling the window panes and howling through the pine trees, but inside the cabin warmth and peace prevailed. As Sabrina slipped into healing sleep, Christian kept his vigil, one hand slowly stroking her hair. The gesture was both a comfort and a promise. She would never have reason to run again. The fire painted golden light across their huddled forms as the afternoon deepened toward evening. Christian's coat draped around Sabrina like a shield, and her breathing had grown deep and even. The last of the fear-driven tension had eased from her face, replaced by a contentment that tugged at his heart. He studied her features in the firelight, seeing past the surface others had mocked to the gentle strength beneath. She had already proven her worth 10 times over, in her careful tending of his home, her courage with the wolves, her quiet determination to earn her place. The thought that she had believed herself unwanted made his chest ache. Snow continued to build against the windows, but Christian paid it no mind. His world had narrowed to this moment, this hearth, this precious weight in his arms. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together. The lonely silence that had haunted his cabin for so long had been banished by her presence. Sabrina stirred slightly in her sleep, burrowing closer to his warmth. Christian adjusted the blankets around her, his touch gentle as a prayer. "Sleep easy," he whispered. "You're safe now. You're home." The fire crackled softly in response, casting its steady light over them both as the storm raged impotently beyond the cabin walls. Within, two souls who had known too much of loneliness had finally found their harbor. The mountain storm broke at dawn, leaving behind a pristine blanket of snow and skies washed clean and blue. Christian and Sabrina set out early, their wagon wheels cutting fresh tracks through the glittering white. The courthouse bell tolled 9 times as they approached the settlement, its clear notes ringing across the hushed morning air. Sabrina clutched her mother's Bible close, the precious deed tucked safely within its pages. Her hands trembled slightly, but her chin remained high. Christian guided the horses through town, noting how people paused their morning routines to watch them pass. Word of the land dispute had spread quickly through the settlement. "Remember," Christian said quietly, as he helped her down from the wagon, "you have nothing to be ashamed of. That land is rightfully yours." The courthouse steps were already crowded with onlookers. The saloon-keeper stood near the entrance, flanked by 2 rough-looking men. His lips curled into a mocking smile as Sabrina approached. "Well, if it ain't the runaway bride," he drawled, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Come to admit you've no claim to that water rights deed?" Christian stepped forward, but Sabrina touched his arm. "No," she said softly. "Let him talk. His words can't hurt me anymore." Inside the courthouse, morning light streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes in golden beams. The wooden benches filled quickly with townsfolk, their whispered conversations creating a steady murmur. Judge Harrison, a weather-beaten man with keen eyes, sat behind his massive oak desk, sorting through papers. The saloon-keeper swaggered to the front, producing documents with a flourish. "Your Honor, I have here a legal transfer of deed, signed and witnessed, granting me full rights to both the land and water access in question." He shot a superior look toward Sabrina. "The girl's father made the deal fair and square to settle his debts." Judge Harrison adjusted his spectacles, examining the papers. "And where is Mr. Turner today?" "My father," Sabrina's voice caught. She squared her shoulders and continued more firmly. "My father left town 3 days ago. He has not returned." Knowing chuckles rippled through the crowd. Everyone knew William Turner's habits of drinking away his troubles and disappearing for days. "Convenient," the saloon-keeper smirked. "But his signature stands?" The simple fact is, the girl's too addled to manage property. Why, look how she needed a man's protection right quick when things got rough. Ain't that right, Christian? Christian's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, a clear voice cut through the murmurs. "I will speak for her." The crowd parted as Nalin walked forward, her dark eyes steady and dignified. She wore a beautifully beaded dress, her long black hair braided with leather ties. Several people shifted uncomfortably. The Comanche woman rarely participated in settler affairs. "Your Honor," Nolan said, her English precise and measured, "I knew Sarah Turner, Sabrina's mother. I was present when she acquired that land, trading fairly with my people before the settlement was established." The saloon-keeper's smile faltered slightly. "This ain't got nothing to do with—" "Let her speak," Judge Harrison interrupted, leaning forward with interest. Nolan continued, her voice carrying easily through the now silent courthouse. "Sarah Turner was a wise woman who learned our healing ways. She traded medicines and knowledge for that land, recording everything properly by both our customs and yours. I witnessed her signature on the original deed." She gestured to Sabrina. "The daughter now carries her mother's paper." All eyes turned to Sabrina as she stepped forward, Bible clutched tight. Her hands shook as she carefully extracted the deed, but her voice remained steady. "This is my mother's deed," she said, presenting it to the judge. "She left it to me, hidden in her Bible where my father couldn't find it. She knew." Sabrina swallowed hard. She knew he would try to sell it away. Judge Harrison examined the document carefully, comparing dates and signatures. The saloon-keeper's face darkened as minutes ticked by. "This deed predates your claim," the judge finally announced, "and bears the territorial governor's seal, along with proper witnesses." He looked directly at the saloon-keeper. "Including several signatures from respected tribal elders, which Nolan can verify." "That's impossible," the saloon-keeper sputtered. "The girl's father could not sell what he did not own." Judge Harrison's voice turned stern. "Sarah Turner specifically left this land to her daughter. William Turner had no legal right to negotiate its sale, regardless of his debts." Sabrina felt Christian's hand slip into hers, offering silent support as the judge continued. "Furthermore," Judge Harrison held up the saloon-keeper's documents, "these papers show signs of recent alteration. The ink is too fresh, the signatures inconsistent." His gaze hardened. "I will be launching an investigation into this attempted fraud." The saloon-keeper's face turned an ugly shade of red. "You can't—" "I can, and I will." Judge Harrison struck his desk with his gavel. "This court recognizes Sabrina Turner's rightful ownership of the land in question. The case is adjourned until tomorrow morning, when we will address the matter of fraudulent documentation." He fixed the saloon-keeper with a stern look. "I suggest you bring a lawyer." The crowd erupted in excited chatter. Christian squeezed Sabrina's hand, pride evident in his expression. "You did it," he whispered. Nolan approached them as people began filing out of the courthouse. "Your mother would be proud," she told Sabrina softly. "You showed her same quiet strength today." Tears welled in Sabrina's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for speaking truth when no one else would." The Comanche woman smiled, touching Sabrina's cheek in a gesture of kinship. "Truth has its own power. It cannot stay buried forever." The saloon-keeper stormed past them, his face dark with fury. "This ain't over," he spat, but his threat sounded hollow in the bright morning air. Outside the courthouse, townsfolk gathered in small groups, discussing the morning's events. Several nodded respectfully to Sabrina as she passed. Christian helped her into the wagon, then turned to Nolan. "We're much obliged," he said sincerely. "Would you join us for dinner tonight?" "Least we can do." Nolan inclined her head gracefully. "I would be honored." As they drove home through the glittering snow, Sabrina held her mother's Bible close. The morning sun caught crystal sparkles in the fresh powder, making the world seem clean and new. Christian glanced at her, noting how she sat straighter, confidence replacing her usual hesitancy. "Your mother gave you more than just land," he said softly. "She gave you her courage, too." Sabrina smiled, touching the worn Bible cover. "I always thought I was alone after she died. But today, with you and Nayland standing beside me..." She looked up at him, eyes bright with unshed tears. I finally felt her strength inside me. Christian guided the horses carefully through the snow-laden pines. You always had that strength, he said. You just needed the chance to show it. They rode on in comfortable silence, the wagon wheels cutting fresh tracks through the pristine snow. The morning's victory had changed something in Sabrina. As if by standing up for her mother's legacy, she had finally claimed her own place in the world. Morning sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows as people filed in for the second day of proceedings. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of what seemed like half the town, all eager to witness the final ruling. Sabrina sat straight-backed beside Christian in the front row, her mother's Bible resting in her lap like a shield. The saloon-keeper slouched at the defendant's table, his fancy vest wrinkled, and his face bearing the shadows of a sleepless night. His lawyer, hastily summoned from Denver, shuffled papers with nervous fingers. Behind them, the hired men who had been intimidating the ranch sat subdued, their earlier bravado dissolved under the judge's scrutiny. Judge Harrison entered, his black robes sweeping as he took his seat. The crowd rose and settled again at his gesture. He adjusted his spectacles, reviewing the documents spread before him one final time. After careful examination of all evidence, Judge Harrison began, his voice carrying to every corner of the hushed room. Including testimony from multiple witnesses and thorough investigation of the documents presented, this court is prepared to render its verdict. Sabrina felt Christian's hand slip into hers. She squeezed back, drawing strength from his steady presence. The original deed presented by Miss Turner bears all proper seals and signatures, with dates and witnesses that establish clear providence, the judge continued. Furthermore, examination by court experts confirms that the competing documents submitted by the defendant show clear signs of forgery, including altered dates and fabricated signatures. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The saloon-keeper's face darkened, but his lawyer placed a warning hand on his arm. Therefore, this court rules in favor of Miss Sabrina Turner, recognizing her full and legal ownership of both the land and associated water rights, as inherited from her mother, Sarah Turner. Judge Harrison's gavel struck with finality. The defendant's claims are hereby dismissed as fraudulent. The courtroom erupted in cheers. Several women who had once whispered cruel jokes about Sabrina now called out congratulations. Nalin, watching from the back, smiled and nodded in quiet approval. Furthermore, Judge Harrison continued, silencing the room, this court orders the defendant to cease all harassment and intimidation of Miss Turner and her property. The evidence of attempted fraud will be forwarded to territorial authorities for potential criminal prosecution. The saloon-keeper surged to his feet, face mottled with rage. This is outrageous! That land dash. Sit down, his lawyer hissed, yanking him back into his chair. Unless you want to add contempt of court to your troubles. Near the back of the courtroom, Sabrina spotted her father slumped against the wall. William Turner looked smaller somehow, his usual bluster deflated. When their eyes met briefly, he quickly looked away, shame written in every line of his face. Without a word, he slipped out the door, disappearing like morning mist. The hired men followed suit, dispersing quickly now that their employer's power had crumbled. Several touched their hats awkwardly to Sabrina as they passed, perhaps remembering their own sisters or daughters. Court is adjourned, Judge Harrison declared, striking his gavel one final time. People surrounded Sabrina and Christian, offering congratulations and warm wishes. The preacher's wife pressed Sabrina's hand, tears in her eyes. Your mother would be so proud, dear, she whispered. You stood up with such grace. Thank you, Sabrina managed, her own eyes welling up. She felt taller somehow, as if a great weight had lifted from her shoulders. Christian beamed beside her, his quiet pride evident in every glance. This was not the same trembling girl who had clutched his sleeve outside the saloon, begging for protection. She had found her own strength, earned her own respect. "Shall we head home?" he asked softly when the crowd finally thinned. Home. The word settled warm in Sabrina's heart. Not just shelter anymore, but truly home. The ride back to the ranch was peaceful, winter sunshine glinting off fresh snow. Christian handled the reins while Sabrina held her mother's Bible, occasionally touching its worn cover, as if to reassure herself this wasn't all a dream. "I never thought I'd see the day," Christian said as they crested the hill overlooking their valley. "That saloon-keeper's had this town under his thumb for years. Took someone special to stand up to him." Sabrina blushed at the praise. "I had help," she said softly. "You, Nalin, the judge. Everyone who chose truth over fear." "You gave them something to stand behind," Christian replied. "Your mother's deed might have been the legal proof, but it was your courage that won them over." The ranch looked different somehow as they approached, though nothing had physically changed. The cabin still stood sturdy against the mountain backdrop, smoke curling from its chimney where they'd banked the morning fire. The barn's weather-worn boards still held strong, sheltering horses and hay. But now it all felt truly hers, not just a haven of necessity, but a home claimed through justice and truth. Inside, Sabrina set about preparing supper while Christian tended to the evening chores. She worked with quiet joy, remembering how lost she'd felt that first night in the kitchen. Now her hands moved with confidence as she mixed cornbread and stirred the bean pot, adding the herbs Nalin had taught her would bring out the flavor. When Christian came in, stamping snow from his boots, the cabin glowed with lamplight and warmth. The table was set simply but with care, tin plates polished bright, cups turned just so, a small bunch of dried wildflowers Sabrina had saved from summer in the center. "Smells wonderful," Christian said, washing up at the basin. Sabrina smiled, then surprised them both by saying, "Would you mind if I say grace tonight?" Christian's eyes softened. "I'd like that very much." They joined hands across the table, heads bowed. Sabrina's voice trembled slightly at first, then grew stronger. "Dear Lord, we thank you for this food and for all your mercies, for justice that prevails even when hope seems lost, for friends who stand beside us in truth, for the legacy of those who loved us enough to prepare our way." She squeezed Christian's hands gently. "And most of all, for bringing light out of darkness and turning strangers into family." "Amen." "Amen," Christian echoed softly. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, savoring both the meal and the peace that settled around them like a warm blanket. The fire crackled in the hearth, and outside, a lone coyote called to the rising moon, not a threat anymore, just part of the night's familiar song. "What happens now?" Sabrina asked finally, stirring the last bits of cornbread in her bowl. Christian looked at her thoughtfully. "Whatever you want to happen. It's your land, your life." "Our land," she corrected gently. "The water rights serve both properties. We'll need to work together to make the most of it." He smiled, recognizing her practical wisdom. "True enough, though I reckon you've proved you can handle whatever comes your way." Sabrina rose to clear the dishes, pausing beside his chair. "Having someone believe in me made all the difference," she said softly. "Thank you for that." Christian caught her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. "You did the believing yourself. I just witnessed it." She squeezed his hand once, before moving to the wash basin, her heart full. Through the window, stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, she thought, her mother was smiling. Justice had been done, dignity restored, and love, unexpected, unlooked-for love, had bloomed like a winter rose through the snow. The church bells rang clear across the settlement that Sunday morning, calling folks to worship as they had every week. But something felt different in the crisp winter air. Perhaps it was the way sunshine glinted off fresh snow, or how the morning itself seemed to hold its breath with expectation. The little church filled quickly. Townsfolk stomped snow from their boots in the entrance, greeting each other with warm smiles. The pews creaked under the weight of their Sunday best as neighbors squeezed together, sharing hymn books and quiet conversation. Sabrina sat near the middle, her heart light despite the curious glances still cast her way. The past week's victory in court had changed things. Where once there had been whispers of mockery, now there were nods of respect. She smoothed her best dress, a simple brown wool she'd carefully pressed the night before, and focused on the preacher's words about God's providence and mercy. Christian sat beside her, closer than usual, his shoulder occasionally brushing hers. She noticed his hands were restless, fingers tapping against his knee. Twice during the sermon, she caught him glancing at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between nervousness and determination. The service drew to a close with a final hymn. As the last notes of Amazing Grace faded away, the preacher raised his hands for the benediction. But before he could speak, Christian stood suddenly. "Begging your pardon, preacher," he said, his voice carrying clear and strong through the hushed church. "Might I say something before we conclude?" The preacher's eyebrows rose, but he nodded, stepping aside from the pulpit. Christian moved into the center aisle, then turned to face Sabrina. Her heart began to pound as he took her hand, gently drawing her to her feet. "Folks of this congregation," Christian began, his voice steady despite the color rising in his cheeks. "You all know what brought Sabrina to my ranch, a desperate plea for protection, a pretense of marriage to save her from a terrible fate." Murmurs rippled through the pews. Sabrina felt her face flush, but Christian's grip on her hand remained warm and sure. "What started as pretense has grown into something true and precious," he continued. "This brave woman has proven herself not just on my ranch, but to this whole community. She's faced down wolves to save a child, stood up to injustice in court, and shown more courage than many men I know." He took a deep breath, then slowly lowered himself to one knee. Gasps echoed through the church. Sabrina's free hand flew to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. "Sabrina Turner," Christian said, his voice thick with emotion, "I no longer wish to pretend. I want to be your husband in truth, to cherish and protect you, to work beside you, to build a life together on the land God has blessed us with. Will you marry me?" For a moment, the church was absolutely silent. Sabrina looked down at Christian's upturned face, seeing in his eyes all the care and respect that had grown between them these past weeks. Her voice trembled but rang clear as she answered, "Yes, yes, I will." The church erupted in applause and cheers. Several women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Even the preacher was smiling broadly as he stepped forward. "Well then," he said, raising his hands for quiet, "since we're all gathered here in God's house and these two young people have waited long enough, what do you say we make this official right now?" More cheers answered him. Christian rose to his feet, never letting go of Sabrina's hand. "If you're willing," he asked her softly. Sabrina nodded, joy making her speechless. Someone started humming The Wedding March, and others joined in. The preacher opened his Bible, his voice warm with pleasure. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God and this congregation to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony." As the familiar words washed over them, Sabrina barely heard them. She was lost in Christian's eyes, in the miracle of this moment. When they exchanged vows, their voices rang with certainty. Christian's hands were steady as he slipped his mother's ring onto her finger. He must have been carrying it, planning this moment. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder," the preacher declared. "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Christian drew her close, his kiss gentle but sure. The congregation burst into applause again, this time accompanied by whoops and cheers. When they turned to face their neighbors, Sabrina was amazed by the joy she saw in every face. Women who had once whispered cruel jokes now pressed forward to embrace her, their congratulations sincere. Men pumped Christian's hand, clapping him on the back. Children scattered flower petals saved from summer, the dried blooms fragrant under their feet. The preacher's wife hugged them both, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Such a blessing," she kept saying. "Such a beautiful blessing." Nalin appeared at Sabrina's elbow, pressing a small bundle of herbs into her hands. "For happiness and harmony," she said with a knowing smile, "though I think you have found these already." Throughout it all, Christian kept hold of Sabrina's hand, as if he couldn't quite believe she might be truly his. When their eyes met, his smile was radiant with joy. They were no longer pretending. This was real as the ring on her finger, as true as the love in their hearts, as lasting as the land they would share together. The congregation moved outside into the bright winter morning, forming a happy crowd around the newlyweds. Sunlight sparkled off the snow like scattered diamonds, and the church bells rang out once more. Not calling people to worship now, but celebrating love's victory over fear, truth's triumph over pretense, and the joy of two hearts finding their way home to each other. Weeks had passed since the church wedding, and winter settled deep across the Colorado Valley. Fresh snow draped the mountain peaks like a white quilt, pristine and peaceful in the gathering dusk. Inside the ranch house, warmth and contentment filled every corner. Lamplight danced on the log walls as neighbors crowded around the long pine table. The aroma of fresh-baked bread mingled with hearty beef stew, making mouths water. Sabrina moved between stove and table, her cheeks flushed from the heat and happiness. Each time she passed, Christian's eyes followed her with quiet pride. "This bread is a marvel, Mrs. Matthews," old Mrs. Peterson declared, reaching for a second slice. The name still made Sabrina's heart skip, not from shame anymore, but joy. She was Christian's wife now, truly and properly. At the head of the table, Christian reached over and covered Sabrina's hand with his own. His calloused thumb brushed her knuckles, a gentle gesture that spoke volumes. She squeezed back, remembering that terrified girl outside the saloon who had begged for his protection. How far they had come. Nalin sat near the fire, sharing stories that made everyone laugh. Her presence represented the bridge of understanding that had grown between settlers and their Comanche neighbors. Other townsfolk filled the chairs and benches, the preacher and his wife, the storekeeper's family, even the sheriff and his deputy. Outside, winter wind howled around the eaves, but it only made the warmth inside feel more precious. The fireplace crackled and popped, casting golden light across familiar faces. These were no longer just neighbors, but family of the heart. Sabrina paused in serving to take in the scene. Laughter echoed off the walls. Children played quietly in the corner with corn-husk dolls. The room glowed with fellowship and faith. In that moment, watching Christian chat easily with their guests, Sabrina felt the truth settle deep in her soul. She was no longer the unwanted girl, mocked and scorned. She had become wife, neighbor, friend, and above all, a beloved daughter of God. Her heart swelled with gratitude as she bowed her head in silent prayer, thanking him for bringing her home at last. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.